What I wanted to talk about today is a framework that I've used mentally since I started swing dancing back in the times when that movie was popular, and I still use to this day. I've only recently learned some interesting concepts to help describe it, and thanks to Wikipedia. So I'm talking about the evolution of a leader's mind from beginner to a more advanced state using concepts of human cognition and programming. I am not a programmer and I am not a scientist, so this is going to be extremely dumbed down. So this is really just to have an opening slide, but we all come from somewhere, we all have a different beginning, and our minds are in a different place. For me, the first thing I saw was this movie, and I had to learn how to swing dance. The learning is hard, so what happens next mentally is, I think, very interesting to discuss. You have a question?
No, I'm here for you.
So first I want to start with some definitions of the concepts that I'm going to then use again to describe through dancing. Dancing, that is. So this one stuck out to me in my research. I'll read it real quick and then emphasize. Procedural learning is the act of repeating a complex activity over and over again until all the relevant neural systems work together to automatically produce the activity. Distributed practice is the most efficient method of procedural learning. By equally distributing the amount of practice of a given activity over a period of time, you will increase the efficiency of learning that skill. The second half of that definition I left on there because we've all taken a lot of time to learn swing dancing. Distributed weekly over Thursday nights for me. Sometimes you cram it into a weekend, whatever. But what I really wanted to emphasize was this sentence. Until all the relevant neural systems work together to automatically produce the activity. It's the automatic word that I want you to hold in your short-term memory for the rest of my talk, because that's the key to how I've learned how to swing dance. And I'm hoping a lot of us shared that experience. Encoding is another word that comes from human cognition research. It's the basic perceptual process of interpreting incoming stimuli. Technically speaking, it is a complex, multi-stage process of converting relatively objective sensory input, sounds and light as an example, into subjectively meaningful experience. And then for the last definition, I recently encountered this one, and I had to include it as soon as I learned it. Before I define this, which you're all reading right now, I'm sure, understand the first early programming, when you just start to learn, is very linear. You tell the machine to do something in order. First execute this line of code, then execute this line of code, and so on until the program hits end. Then I learned about event-driven programming, which by definition would be a programming paradigm in which the program flow is determined by events, sensor outputs, or user actions, i.e. the event of a mouse click. Key presses is another event that happens that then dictates what's going to happen next in the program. And it also can receive messages from other programs or threads. So that sounds all really complex and technical, but the lesson I learned or listened to on this topic described it best as waiting. Event-driven programming waits for the inputs and waits for the next thing to happen that triggers the functions you've programmed into the code. And so when I heard about that, it really got me thinking about dance in that way, because there's so many cues that we take from something external. So let's back up on a couple of those definitions again and bring it back into dance. I would just change it barely at all to read it as a perceptual process. Encoding dance into our minds would be a perceptual process of interpreting incoming stimuli, relatively objective sensory input, the music, movements you're making, movements of others in the room, your dance partner, and then converting it into a subjectively meaningful, complete experience. And it sounds all technical, but it's really just how we have a good dance. We bring the meaning to the dance, but it's only through running this program in our head that it says, run program Lindy Hop when you shake hands with somebody. And so I couldn't resist making a dance acronym. So I would change EDPD driven dance to EDPDD, which in my mind I'm picturing a mini dip when I do that, This paradigm would work for me, I think, in which the dance flow is determined by sensory information, user actions, two dancers, or messages returned from other subconscious programs that you've previously programmed. When I'm thinking of that last one, subconscious programs, that's pretty much learning a move. You are calling up that move, run program mini dip, run program swing out, and that begins to create new outputs after you finish that swing out. The follow at the end of your arm is now going to swivel in a certain way. That creates a new output, and then you start editing and modifying the code in your head that says, well, how do I react to this or call up something else to do? So I might have actually jumped ahead a little bit, but I kind of wrote that out in words with just the definition earlier. I won't bother reading it again since I did just kind of say that. So this can have both positive and negative connotations, of course, too. I can't tell you how many subroutines I've rewritten in my head because on the fly, on the dance floor in a social dance, because I hit somebody or what have you. I think of the example of a taller follow and you whack her in the head during a side pass. It's really embarrassing, but you just make a little adjustment, I tried to write it as a code, but I don't really know code yet. But basically, if follow height is greater than 6, hand height minimum plus 4. Something along those lines. I have so many more little things like that in my head. Another favorite example I want to share is I'll be dancing with a follow who will express in the first introductions while we're chatting and getting to the center of the floor or whatever. She'll express something like, my knee is hurting. And I'll say, well, which one? And I have an entire subroutine in my mind that I've pre-programmed about, okay, eliminate these 17 moves because those are going to focus on the right knee. And now bring to the on-deck mode more of the other moves that are upper body. It's all going on in my head as we start to begin the dance. So in event-based programming, this is now getting into areas that I less know personally from coding, but just from Wikipedia, so just bear with me. Wikipedia says that the first step in developing an event-driven program is to write a series of subroutines called event handlers routines. These routines handle the events to which the main program will respond. For example, a single left button mouse click on a command button in a user interface program may trigger a routine that will open another window or save to a database. So I started to use that as the framework to say, well, what would my Lindy Hop handlers do? What does it help me do to describe Lindy Hop using that kind of definition? I said it earlier, I'll just repeat it. It's basically learning a move, where I write it in my mind as a series of subroutines, and that I'll later call it up when it's triggered by a certain event. Charleston comes to mind. You could spend an entire lesson on where to place your right hand on the back of the follow, and all of those minute adjustments to your mental code later get called up over and over again. And after they are learned, we then build event handlers to run the program moves during the events to which the main program will respond. And I put in parentheses music because I think that's the main trigger that we should all be striving to dance towards. But I do also count the follow in there and the musicians on stage. There's so many other cues or inputs that can be doing this. Practice to me is like reprogramming or refining that code so that it's more efficient and more useful in different situations. Just to kind of keep going on this analogy, listening to a CD without dancing to it, for us dancers, I think can be very difficult because it's like waiting forever for the music to trigger an event, or these programs that we've now put into our bodies of, I want to be dancing. All of my programming is telling me I should be dancing, but I can't. So now I want to talk a little bit more about how this plays out when you're a new leader and you're trying to get to a certain point. There's a lot flying around in your brain, and so we have some definitions of working memory, or a short-term memory. I also put RAM in there because it's very relevant to what's randomly being accessed. So it holds multiple pieces of transitory information in the mind where they can be manipulated. And I have this theory in my head of this Zen master Lindy Hop at the top of some mountain who basically says to these students that come see him, I have forgotten more than you remember, or forgotten it more than you know. So sometimes they call these concepts slave memory, and they model short-term memory in these areas: the central executive, phonological loop, episodic buffer, visual space, blah blah blah, a bunch of technical terms. I got to speed up here. So let's just quickly put this to Lindy Hop. I think the central executive is where you're making those decisions as the leader. You're deciding swing out or side pass, swing out or side pass, over and over again as you dance. This auditory section of short-term memory, they define it, the cognitive scientists, as where language is processed and listening to words. But it's interesting if you click through a few more links and think about, well, how do these cognitive scientists define gestures? And it's not too many links later that they start saying gestures are processed exactly the same as dance. And that makes dance, I'm just going a couple layers deeper, saying that dance is a part of language, and if I had to figure out where dance is being processed in my short-term memory, probably be in that section that these scientists are calling the phonetical loop. Because that's where you're also repeating something so you don't forget it, like repeating somebody's phone number so you can dial it or something like that. Well, it sounds a lot to me like repeating 5, 6, 7, 8 in your head when you're dancing. And then there's also what things mean. The visual spatial scratch pad, as they've technically called it, is really where you're thinking in your short-term memory about space and time and where my body is in space. Later, this was not always there, the episodic buffer. They've added it in recent years because they needed something to explain that your short-term memory needs the ability to cross domains and use all the things that they have. This slide, I think, is the crux of the whole concept I was trying to explain today. That there's so much going on in a leader's mind as they run the program Lindy Hop, that this is getting juggled. And in event-driven programming, it's like a queue of things happening, and they have to you need the central executive part of your short-term memory to decide what do you execute first out of your queue. So let's break it first into event selection. That comes back to that definition of waiting for an event to happen that I want to respond to through dance. Listening to the music is part of that, and triggering other programs. The second part of this application, if I were to write one, would be event handling, which is how do you decide which of the available subroutines to run in dancing, which move do you choose, and I don't remember why I wrote that. So what is it like for a new leader? Basically their head is exploding. Working memory for a new leader, that RAM is completely at capacity. They have nothing left to really be listening. Their head is so full of numbers and things they heard a teacher say. Even the smallest concepts about not putting your thumb and pinching down on the follower's hand can take the most amount of attention when you're a new leader. It's really well described as a selfish dance when you dance with those beginner leads, and just bear with them and give them hope. They're really just incapable of thinking of others during this stage of development. I even made a slide to try to illustrate it, but the whole point is, how many dances have you had where the music is great, and all you're thinking to yourself is 1, 2, 3, and 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. 1, 2, 3, and 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. Quick, back step, quick, back step. Oh, I should touch her back sometime. And so, what happens when you evolve to more of an immediate lead? basically those subroutines now are happening automatically, and that's what I wanted to return to, is that automatic, or I like the word a lot, subconscious. No effort in your short-term working memory was needed to take this action with my body. So once that capacity is freed up, they do start to hear the music again, and they do start to sense what the follows are doing to also offer up these events to react to. The great swivel is a great example. I can remember the night, I had been dancing for 6 months as a new leader. And that seems like a long time. Most leaders will not outlast their own learning curve. And that was the night I heard the music. And I'd already been out 150 times. But when I started to hear the music, when I was dancing, I can remember it was just phenomenal. And so the problem with learning and rewriting your code is you have revelation constantly, where you just realize what used to work doesn't work anymore, and it's become easier. So, or it can go the other way and you have breakthroughs, but it's almost painful to delete lines of code that are no longer serving you. I can think of definitions advanced dancers gave 10 years ago that are just no longer being used. You know, today they're traveling the world talking about triple steps, which we barely talked about in 1999. But you can watch these celebrity dancers all start to have themes, and what I see them doing is, as a collective, refining these subroutines for all of us to share. So one quick little litmus test, if you will, if you're like, am I an intermittent lead, is can you carry on a conversation while you're still dancing? Because the research shows if you are now talking verbally, you disrupt subconscious activity. And so if you are able to still do this, that means you've embedded it into that muscle memory point where it's really happening automatically. I would also challenge people, though, to ask yourself, are you dancing well while you're having a conversation? That may require feedback. So what's an advanced lead look like? They have encoded countless movements into their subconscious, using many of them at the same time as others. They can learn faster because the code base is cleaned up, and it provides a solid foundation to take in new learning and advice from other people that would be teaching them. And they almost start to dance selflessly, which is probably why they seem so joyful when we dance with them, because they are learning during the dance from their follow, from the music, as much as they are creating a dance. One thing, I've only briefly encountered these types of feelings. I would describe it as like when you end a move completely different than you usually do 99% of the time, and it's based, you ended that move slightly different because of something you heard or saw in your follow. And it's just a wonderful feeling. You really get some swag. Now, there's another level that I think is out there, and I've only witnessed this in people like Sky Humphreys, but it's where they are a Zen leader. They are completely blank in their short-term memory because everything is subconscious, and they're waiting to select the absolutely best stimuli to dance to. And it's just a phenomenal thing. I've heard Stefan talk about it as the flow. When he gave me a private lesson, he said what he was working on was finding this flow between moves where only the next move he selected made the most sense from the previous movement. And it's not about where one move ended, it was about flowing through the entire move. And they completely participate in the song at that point. And I've had those moments. So how would you know if you've reached the Zen level? That's where you really create a move that you could never repeat again. And I just think that's a phenomenal level of dance to get to. I can't even say that I've had it that often. I could probably count on both hands how many times I've almost wanted to stop the entire rest of the dance in the song because whatever happened was so perfect for that 3.5 seconds. Give her credit though, she definitely inspired whatever that moment was. It was how she's following. We both are at that level, and it just becomes something spontaneous and beautiful. So that's my whole presentation, and I'm over time, so it's great.
If you have 1 or 2 questions, that's okay too, but otherwise... We're good?
You can find us in there.
Okay.